We are so pleasantly surprised to see all of you here. And we're delighted to have a return visit from Joan Baum. And we were trying to remember, which I cannot, but I believe this may be her fourth visit here. And I think the last time some of you were here, she talked about grammar.
Yes.
And we're delighted that she's here again to talk about a whole new subject. For those of you who haven't been introduced to Joan Baum, I'll tell you a few things about her. Joan Baum taught literature and writing for CUNY for many years as a tenured professor of English. She has a PhD at the end of her name, by the way, and calls herself a recovering academic. Her graduate school specialty was British literary history from 1770 to 1832, and her books include The Calculating Passion of Ada Byron, about Byron's mathematical daughter, who is reputed to have been the world's first computer programmer, working with Charles Babbage and Mind-Forged Manacles, a study of, this is another book, a study of what the major English Romantic poets, including Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, Shelley, and Keats, did to advance ending the slave trade and slavery in Britain in the early 19th century. In her retirement, she professes to be delighted to drift into various other time zones, both scholarly and literally. She writes regularly for Dan's papers, doing book reviews and articles, and she is the book reviewer for WSHU, the Connecticut-based NPR station. Please welcome Joan Baum.
Thank you. Just as I heard that introduction, and thank you very much, it occurs to me that my former life with romantic literature and the big five, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, Keats, and Shelley, has some association with the talk today, because probably the romantic poets were the first group to write autobiographical poetry. Not autobiography, but poetry that, as Wordsworth said, was an overflow, a spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling recollected in tranquility. And there began all of the autobiographical interest in poetry. I am delighted to be here today to talk to you about a subject that interests me, and therefore I thank you for coming and sparking the idea that a talk may clarify for me what I hope will be clarified for all of us, not just by my talk, but by all of you getting into the conversation before we're through. And it's about one of the most popular, if not the most popular genre today, memoirs. And so first I'd like to tell you a little bit about the reasons for this talk, based on my sense that memoir writing has become so powerful and so successful. And then I'd like to take up a number of themes, and certainly at the end allow you to recommend to the group other books that I may not have mentioned, and to talk about the popularity of memoir writing. As I said, it is the most popular genre. How do I know? How do you know? Look at the bestseller lists. There they are. And something else, just about everyone thinks he or she can write a memoir. I'm a book reviewer. I once got an inquiry of many from a 12-year-old who said, odd as it was, he had a memoir for me to consider. I respectfully passed. I get a lot of inquiries from authors who want to have me look at their work in progress, almost done, self-published. And by the way, let me just say that once upon a time, to be self-published, called Vanity Press publication, was considered not de rigueur. Now I look at anything that looks good because it is so very difficult to get published. The most difficult rejection I had to make from an inquiring author was someone who sent me a manuscript almost done on his experiences in the Holocaust. And it took me a long time to tell him that I could not do it. And the reason I couldn't do it, and I want to discuss this with you, because most of us think of memoirs as subject matter. But the reason I rejected his was that it was poorly written. And I thought, isn't that terrible? Someone who's been in a concentration camp. I mean, I'm not going to say I'm not going to take this because it's poorly written. It took me a long time to craft a proper response. But it put me in mind of two things. One, almost all memoirs have one theme in common, whether it's explicit or implicit: overcoming adversity. And in the case of the Holocaust writer, what greater adversity could there be? He wrote me back, by the way, and without accusing me of being heartless, in effect said that I could not possibly understand what he went through, and he was very disappointed that I did not accept the opportunity to publicize his adversity. That's a hard one, and I do want to bring it up again, as I said, because most people think of the memoir as a subject. I have something I want to say. I've had a hard life. I want to express it. Certainly another reason for talking about memoirs is that they're very popular as sales books. Some of you may remember 14 or 15 years ago the case of James Fry, he's now 47, who wrote a novel called A Million Little Pieces. It was turned down, by the way, by 17 publishers. It was a novel, until he recrafted it and called it a memoir. And then, as some of you may recall, it was picked up. Oprah went wild for it. It sold like crazy, until a number of people started pointing out some inaccuracies. It was about, as the author said, his own life when he was 23 as an alcohol and drug abuser, but he took someone else's life. Doubleday remarkably said in one quotation, and one quotation only, it did fail to check the veracity of the memoir before publicizing it. Which brings up another theme I'd like to have us discuss as we go on. How much license is allowed for dramatic effect before a memoir slides into being a novel? Last night I had the pleasure of attending a rather new group, certainly for me, in Springs, called Story Salon East. A group of people who get together regularly as writers now get together once a week and read parts of their work in progress, all of it destined to be a full memoir. That's what surprised me. And three of the four were terrific, really engaging narratives, even though they were just sections of the memoir. And I thought to myself, these are well done. They're so well done, so dramatically arched, that I wonder how much massaging of the truth there is in the memoir. And that's one other great consideration. What is a memoir and how much does it owe to the truth? If you're Norman Mailer, you might have said years ago, I care about the truth. It's much more important than the facts. And in fact, the difference between factual and truthful may be one way of talking about the difference between autobiography and memoir. But do keep that in mind. Another reason for my wanting to talk about memoirs was that I have become impressed by a recent column in the New York Times by Dwight Garner, who was a former senior editor of the Book Review. Garner regularly, but not every week, mentions a memoir that somehow he came across, that somehow he missed years ago. And I'm impressed by what he says. I recognize none of the books he mentions. Some of them are, in fact, even out of print. But I think that was another reason to prompt me to want to talk about memoir writing when someone who is a well-known critic cites memoirs that he thinks are fabulous books. For example, he cited, and some of you in fact may know these, something called On Fire by Larry Brown, 1994. A memoir by a firefighter in Oxford, Mississippi for 16 years. And Dwight Garner says, it is simply, fiercely written, full of the most incredible stories that move you out, and despite the fact that he is a firefighter, move in themes that will interest everyone. Another one he cited not too long ago by Harry Crews, who is an American novelist and playwright, 1978 memoir, I missed it entirely, called A Childhood, the biography of a place. And again, I'm impressed when a critic risks saying things like, this is the most striking American literary memoir containing the most insanely incredible scene in literature. What is the scene? The memoirist, Harry Crews, describes hog-killing season when he was a child and fell into a scalding pot. Shortly after, speak about getting over adversity, got polio. He came from a very poor Georgia family, and he started reading Sears Roebuck catalogs and started making up stories about the characters and the figures and the text that appeared in the catalog, and became finally, before he died in 2012, a pretty successful writer. It put me in mind of a memoir that has been on the bestseller list for a long time, C.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy. And maybe it's because of the recent national election and the soul-searching on the part of many so-called liberal intellectuals of why they didn't get it about folks in Appalachia. C.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy is about growing up in Appalachia. It's very well written. I have to find out why he became a Republican, but and he writes occasional columns for the New York Times. But it's beautifully done. He also, Garner, cited something else, and it's the one book I brought in, that I should have known about and didn't. It's called Minor Characters, and it's by Joyce Johnson, who was Jack Kerouac's lover for about a year or so. And Dwight Garner calls it one of the most, I mean, this has got to get to you, one of the most hideously undervalued and underread books in American literature. Wow, okay, I've got to read that and see what that's about. And it is a very fine memoir. And I'll tell you a little bit about it later, because I think it's an example of what a fine memoir should be. Namely, not just about a subject, but close to novel. It has character, it has setting, it has a narrative, a driving narrative that's beautifully constructed, and it has a theme. And so it does illustrate, as we try to get on, the question of, is it possible to have guidelines about what makes or what goes into a good memoir? And I think this would be an example to be read, at least for that. Why do people write memoirs? That's another reason I wanted to give the talk. I'd like to hear from you. People say, well, I have an important life, and as we reach the end, I want to leave some kind of a legacy. Fine, but then the question that goes with that is, if this is not family album or legacy manuscript writing, for whom is it intended? Is a memoir, no matter the impulse to write it, to share your story with family, with friends, does that mean that it should be published? And why? Do some people want to write memoirs for cathartic reasons? And I'm going to mention one a little bit later where I think this is the case, where you need justification. It's kind of a version of St. Augustine, who did his confessions and called them apologia pro vita sua, a apologies for my life, but it's apology in the sense of I'm going to explain my life of sin and show you how I came from that and why to paradise. Rousseau had the same idea. Another consideration about memoir writing: can it be taught? This is not an idle question. As an academic, I've been to a lot of conferences, literary conferences that, have the usual breakup of subjects. And for a long while, how to get a literary agent was the one subject that drew the most people to literary conferences. No longer. It's how to write a memoir. So I don't even mean how to, but can memoir writing be taught? Are there criteria? Are there guidelines? And is there agreement among us all about what a great memoir is? I've just touted this book about Kerouac, Minor Characters. But I often think that recommending books is like recommending cars or doctors. If you have one, it's the best. He's the best, she's the best. And I don't know. What I didn't want to have is an opportunity to talk about memoir writing that would turn into or devolve into, listen, have you read? And the answer is, no, I haven't, but have you? And it just becomes an exchange of items. I really would like us to see if we can get some themes about the guidelines and the contents of the memoir writing. Another point about memoir writing, again, taking recommendations from people. Not too long ago, a librarian, not at this library, said, oh, you must read. And the book was called Frankie's Place. I had never heard of it. And it came out in 2003. And because it was the librarian who was telling me everybody was checking it out and he thought it was wonderful, I should read it. I did. It's written by a man by the name of James Sturber, who's a very good writer. And it's a memoir about the author's meeting with and deepening love affair with Francis Fitzgerald, who is a writer who won the Pulitzer Prize in Bancroft for Fire in the Lake, about Americans in Vietnam. Sturber is a very fine journalist, and it's obvious in the memoir that he is totally besotted with Francis, called Frankie. But as I read it, I started to get itchy and started to get bored and eventually gave up. It was much too long. The best parts were on Maine, and that, I thought, enhanced the story as a memoir because you had setting, and it was the setting of his romance and its blossom. So I went back to the librarian and I said, listen, I thank you for the recommendation. Did you love it? No, I didn't love it. Neither did I. But he thought that the parts that were well worth recommending would get to me. So recommendations, even though they're well-intentioned, and I'm sure before we finish tonight we're going to hear them from each other, and I hope so, but they can be misleading. And one of the ways they can be misleading got to me. They can be misleading if an author is on TV talking about the memoir and he or she is absolutely exciting. And this happened to me not too long ago when I saw 73-year-old writer Richard Ford on PBS. He's a good writer, I knew his stuff, and he was absolutely charming. He was talking about a memoir he had just published, half of it about his father, the other half about his mother. I tore into the library, get me that memoir. No, everyone else saw the same program. You'll have to get on the waiting list. And so I did, and so I finally read it. And again, I was disappointed. All the liveliness and the regionality of the author didn't come across to me in the memoir. And in fact, one of the two questions I had for him, really to myself, was the fact that he mentions that he went to the Jefferson Davis School in Mississippi, where he's from. There was nothing in the memoir on race. He also said he was haunted by the fact that his father died when he was 16, and he never went to the funeral. And I'm waiting to see why. I'm waiting for an accounting. It was never addressed. And I got the sense the memoir, and this is not to knock the reason, but the memoir was kind of compensatory, a kind of funeral delivery, a kind of eulogy that somehow didn't get out during one's life, a catharsis, if you will. Memoirs are not only popular, they are so pervasive that I now note that there are sub-genres. And not too long ago, some of you may have seen this, the New York Times had a full page of what it called the marriage memoir, otherwise known as, and I quote, autopathologies of marriages that failed. I mean, this has become a whole new area, and I'm sure if you think about other areas that constitute subgenres, they would obtain. So the point is that this is an extremely hot topic, and I'm sure that there are lots of people here who are writing or thinking of writing memoirs, and I hope that nothing I say is a downer. In fact, just the opposite. I hope you go back and look again at your motives for writing, because that will affect the audience you want. And then look at not what you are writing about, but how, the style, the structure, the tone. You could perhaps at the end of that say, okay, no more memoir, I'm doing an autobiography. And that's in a way easier because the expectations of an autobiography are beginning, middle, end, usually chronological approach, usually more fact-based, as Mailer would say, and more detailed. In an autobiography, the author is less likely to be critical. But autobiographies are not necessarily what they seem. Also, some of you may remember the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, which was written by Gertrude Stein, and about Gertrude Stein. She was just fooling around and having a wonderful time. But memoirs also may not be what they seem. Several years ago, a memoir came out by someone whom I knew as a writer from the papers, Toni Bentley. She still does a lot of work for the Times. And it was called The Surrender, an Erotic Memoir. Toni Bentley had been for many years with the New York City Ballet. And I thought, this is terrific, behind-the-scenes romance of the ballet. Because memoirs, unlike autobiographies, have themes. That is one of their distinguishing features. Well, it turns out that it was indeed an erotic memoir, and for subject matter alone, but she's a fine writer. Take a look. It came out in 2005. It is the first, and to my knowledge, the only memoir about her delight in anal sex. It is extraordinary, and you get going and you say, I can't really finish this. But it talks about the surrender that she makes to this particular activity and why. And I think it is extremely well done. But it's misleading because you would not have expected that. There's another one that I recently took a look at by Stephen King, On Writing, a memoir of craft. I thought, well, there's a theme he pulls out of his life. And again, the memoir, vis-a-vis autobiography, has a theme, and it's usually a selection from one's life about what meant the most or what became a profession for the writer. But it turns out that Stephen King, who did have a bizarre accident toward the end of his writing life before he had a second wind, and went on to write more, it had basically nothing to do with that. It was really a kind of, I don't know how many of you remember Strunk and White. It was a little thin manual about how to be a good writer. Be short, direct. It was, on prose. But it was really a rehash, though it was called a memoir of the craft. And I so expected to learn something about the way he went about writing and why. I didn't. The only memorable part was probably an obvious part where he says, you can't make a good writer out of a competent writer, but you can go from competent to better. Sometimes a memoir is surprising in what it intends to do, but backfires. And here I think of Claire Bloom leaving a doll's house, where she savaged her marriage to Philip Roth. Unfortunately, she didn't do a strong enough job in presenting herself as a character, and she didn't realize with whom she was dealing, though she should have. He came back and wrote I Married a Communist, where he just gave another version of her facts. And in fact, Judy Shepard, who was co-publisher of the Permanent Press, whose books I often review, mentioned not too long ago that she had looked at 2 manuscripts by a husband and wife, and they were not exactly the same. So again, if there's truth to be had, it may not emerge from the same set of facts. Most memoirs, unlike autobiographies, another distinguishing feature, most memoirs are in prose, and most are designed for adults. But there have been notable exceptions. One was Jacqueline Woodson's autobiographical memoir in verse, which won the 2014 National Book Award, Brown Girl Dreaming. And it was a book designed for young adults, which I thought was really interesting because it's rare that a memoir will go after that audience, which I think is the hardest audience to capture. Always has been, and now in our digital age, almost impossible. But recently, I was sent a book by a woman by the name of Jill Belowski. She's been doing some readings out here in the bookstores. And it's a memoir. It's called Poetry Can Save Your Life. And she did something interesting as kind of eye-catching. She wrote a memoir. Yes, she had a childhood, an adolescence, and a maturity, and it was filled with overcoming adversity. But what she did, and this is a real neat gimmick, but it worked, was to move through her life by referencing poems that she had read from the age of 10 or so on. And she used these poems as kind of signposts. I'm in this terrible period, my baby has died, I now remember this poem. Or I've come across a new poem, and it puts me in mind of this part of my life. And I think that's pretty ingenious. So again, am I suggesting that your memoir should think of something that no one has done before? Well, if you can do it without it being gimmicky, yes. But she does it to give herself ballast for her title. She does believe that poetry, reading it and rereading it at crucial and critical moments of your life, can save you. Memoirs also, as I said, have themes, and a good writer need not start at the beginning. So I'd like you to consider that as well. Again, the difference between the memoir and the autobiography. Stephen Gaines, I don't know if any of you had read his memoir, which came out a couple of years ago, called One of These Things First, which was really about his coming out gay in a very hostile environment, both immediately in his family and in his larger world. And he doesn't begin at the beginning. He just moves and grabs you and captures you with a fine scene where you're dramatically involved. He's hiding. And then when you're hooked, he starts going back and filling it in. The memoir not only allows you to do this, where autobiographies rarely do, but it invites it. And so again, I guess the overall theme of this talk is, think of the memoir not as what, your life, but how you want to structure it, what you want to pull the reader in with, and how you're going to do it, with what kind of language. A good memoir can have humor. A good memoir can have suspense. And in fact, you read Stephen Gaines and wonder his self-effacing mockery helps you identify with him. And how is he going to get through all this? And he does. Why do people write memoirs? We mentioned this earlier. Well, Jennifer Hartig, my friend, suggested, as I said, that at a certain age we want to memorialize the life we've had. But the question, as I said earlier, is for whom? I started out by telling you of this unfortunate experience I had in rejecting a manuscript on the Holocaust. I had a very dear friend for years with whom I taught who wanted me to take a look at a memoir he was writing, and he was an English professor. It was awful. It was the story of his life for his children. It was a legacy manuscript, and there's nothing wrong with that. He just wanted me to certify, to validate that it was publishable, and I could not do that. We didn't talk for a while. That's very difficult. So if you want people to look at your work, pick someone with whom you can say, look, give me the truth, but I really mean it, but I won't hate you. For sure, another reason for writing a memoir, certainly the word itself etymologically goes back to the 15th century and means a record. And the only people who had records after Gutenberg were important people. But now everybody's writing memoirs. But certainly, if you're famous, a main motive for writing a memoir is, as in Philip Roth's case, to get there before the biographers. So particularly people in controversial fields want to make their statement. And interestingly enough, though, I think the dice are loaded against that because the biographer has what the memoirist rarely, if ever, cites as part of the book: letters, impressions, testimony from others. So it's a richer feel that the biographer has. But still, the memoirist wants to get in there and stake his or her claim. Another reason I mentioned for writing the memoir that may or may not be acknowledged by the author is cathartic. Recently, it was a front-page book review. Daphne Merkin wrote a memoir called This Close to Happy, A Reckoning with Depression. And the book got mixed reviews in this sense. It got good reviews, but then as the review went on, all the problems emerged. And for me, a major problem was that I certainly saw Daphne Merkin's depression, her reasons, her attempts to cope with it, but I didn't see, and this is going to sound terrible, why I should care. In other words, unlike William Styron's Lie Down in Visible Darkness Visible about depression, which is probably the best memoir ever written about depression, I didn't see a movement in the book from personal to universal. There was no engaging with the reader. And in fairness to Daphne, whom I know slightly, by the way, she's always been complaining about her father and mother. So, and she is a Freudian literary critic. So I just saw personally, and this is unfair, a lot of what I had seen before. But basically, I didn't see, again, an engagement with the audience, with the readers. I saw more the need, the terrible need, to publicize her own life and her attempts to get through, obviously successful enough to write the book and to have it reviewed on the front page of the Times. The reviewer who did this in the Times said that the book was a singular blend of self-obsession and ostentatious vulnerability. I don't think those are particularly flattering words. They're descriptive, but they're not necessarily evaluative. He said that the book was full of brittle honesty and blunt nakedness, and its sub-theme should be how to be desolate. In other words, the irony that Daphne Merkin may not have seen in her cathartic need to write this and publicize it was that it came across as still the work of a depressed person rather than a depressed person who had overcome to some extensive period. So again, the question in my case was, when does a memoir, even with cathartic motive, when should the content be left in a psychiatrist's office and not be published? When should the family album treatise be left on the home shelves and not be published? The whole idea of publicizing, of talking to the world, is, I think, one of the most fascinating parts of the motive and the success of writing a memoir. I don't want to go on too long without opening this up, but I'll just conclude by mentioning this book, which I think contains some reasons for thinking that memoir writing, when it's good, can be very, very good, and in effect come close to being a novel, maybe novelistic is the way one should talk about a good memoir. A good memoir has character, like the elements of fiction. Character, plot, setting, and theme. Bad memoirs have just characters, the I. A good memoir has not just the central character, but the terrible irony, which I think she does so well, of reducing the voice, the I, and making it, almost in her own words, a minor character in a larger story. So that in effect, I'm suggesting that the man who wrote the Holocaust manuscript, of course he was focused on himself. And of course he did mention other people in the camps. But somehow I did not get a sense of transcending time, which is another definition of a very good memoir. A good memoir, because it's about setting as themed in other characters, is set in time, does tell you something about the cultural history of the period. But boy, it can be read after that. And I guess, like all good books, my test is, would you ever want to read it again? So if the reason for the memoir is to express yourself exclusively, the answer is probably no. But if part of the memoir, and I'm suggesting a large part, is to give you a sense of the character in time, where you learn about a period, you learn about mores, you learn about manners, you learn history, and you learn something about the time that the regular history, the regular chronicle couldn't do, then it is a good memoir. This memoir got to me, I confess, because of my age. I grew up as the author did in the 50s and 60s, and I was wild about the beats, and I thought Jack Kerouac was the coolest thing to come along. I didn't realize that On the Road, his iconic novel, took off on the road from Ozone Park, Queens, in 1947, that he was college educated, that the whole beat scene was really these folks acting out in the village, but it was a very exciting time. And most of all, what she does is recreate that time with herself as a minor character. And the reason she is the minor character, the main reason, is that at the time, women were all minor characters, all sidekicks, all diminished to the men. Even though she was a fine writer, and in fact when she met Kerouac, she was 21, he was 34, he was broke. She was really on the fast track in a publishing company. She absolutely fell for him. Her career was much more solidly grounded. than his. But she looks back and she understands, or she makes the memoirist that she is understand why it was that women, girls, were minor characters. The wonderful part about this book, even though it's set in the 50s and 60s, is that it's relevant today. And you look back and wonder, who are the sidekicks, and maybe they're the main folks. What is it that prompts bright women to diminish themselves? What was it in the times for bright women? What was it in New York? What was it in the village scene that invited that? So this is a very shrewd looking back at a time that I think has been in American cultural history, the late 50s, the 60s, the most exciting and the most uniquely distinctive in our culture. Here they are, the village people, Black Mountain Crowd, Bucky Fuller, Paul Goodman, de Kooning, John Cage, Merce Cunningham, all of these people full of talent, full of fame, full of destruction. How does she do this? That is really what fascinated me. What she does, and it's amazing, is she doesn't even get to Kerouac until half the book is done. She presents her own life, and then she presents things she knows about him before they meet. And she runs these as parallels. She had an abortion when she was very young. This is another timely aspect of the book. It is one of the most shockingly grisly scenes, and that's what it was like for women. In fact, it may be what it's like for women again. And at the same time she's in the abortionist's office, she goes over to Kerouac, who's out in the Wild West, living by himself, college educated, learning how to be beat and cool. And so without having to be explicit, what this book does as cultural history is explode the myth of who these exciting beat characters were and just how unaccomplished they were. They include a lot of other minor characters, not just women who were in the shadow of the men. And I just want to quote her on one of them because it's an indication of her own writing. She recalls meeting a young beat by the name of Lucien Carr, who was wild about getting to know Jack Kerouac. And this is Joyce Johnson. This rich, dangerous St. Louis boy with the wicked mouth, who had already been kicked out of Bowdoin and the University of Chicago, who's amassed a whole dissipated history by the age of 19, was there. I mean, wow. So she must, I mean, I looked at that, there must have been 5 or 6 really sharp observations about a person who was nonetheless indicative of the young, who were attracted like lambs to some of these more dazzling and destructive cultural, dynamic, sexy leaders. But again, anyone who's known about the 60s as the most fascinating period will enjoy having this as another way of looking at it, and I love what she says about it. The beatniks then meant sex and filth and communism right in the neighborhood, and all respectability robbed of the neighbors forever. The Bowery, filthy places, old hotels, old rooms. You entered a world where janitors refused to give you clean sheets and hookers screamed in courtyards. You were in danger of celebrating Thanksgiving with a solitary turkey special in Bickford's cafeteria on Broadway. And there are these wonderful little observations, but they're in a memoir about her. But she very cleverly casts herself in the central role by diminishing herself ever so slightly. And as I said before, guiding us to what goes into a fine memoir. Yes, it's about the beats, but it's about the whole history of American culture. And so, in summary, what makes for a good memoir? You learn more about other people than you do about the person writing the memoir. You learn a lot about history and culture, and you have recreated for you a sense of the past in time. But you have it so well done that in time is for all time. It moves the story to become universal. You need not have been in the Holocaust. You need not have been in the Greenwich Village bar. This talks to you about larger themes. And again, I'll close with Mailer. Not so much about facts, but about truth. Thank you. We have time, and I deliberately wanted to make sure that I could hear from you, and even more important, this was maybe the last reason I wanted to give this talk. I figured people would show up for writing memoirs. I wanted to give you a chance to talk to each other about what you're doing, why, and for whom. And again, I don't mean to send anyone back to the family album or even the NPR oral histories. You know, they have people come on and talk about their families and their lives. And I do encourage you, if you think you have something that is worthy of publication, to go for it. And there's nothing, as I said, wrong with self-publishing, even a blog. But I would like to hear from those of you who have an impulse to write the memoir, what it is that you think, and let's think of publishing, other people should want to know. And even if it's for the first time now, how you think about taking your subject and placing it in time. What kind of structure do you foresee? How will you gain the reader's interest and keep it? And what kind of style do you want to adopt? So, open floor. Yes?
Can we ask you a question?
Sure.
I am a chef, and my reason for writing a book or attempting to write a book is to pull back the curtain. You know, people in the dining room see one thing, in the kitchen it's totally different.
Mm-hmm.
I've had the good fortune to work for many well-known people, politicians, et cetera, I am worried about being sued. Should you write this under a normal theme? I'm at the beginning, but I'm very serious. I don't know what my liability could be when I expose people.
That's a very good question. Many memoirists will have a note. Certainly autobiographies do, but many memoirs have a note that certain names have been changed. So
But what
if
if
in
they're
a
totally
deal,
recognizable?
You have to change some of your
I'm sorry.
Sorry,
No, please.
it's just funny. I talked to a...
Can everyone hear?
No.
Yeah.
Yeah, so to answer your question, you have to change your name, you have to change, if you signed NDAs, you have to change everything. You can't make the characters recognizable, you can't use your name. Even if you didn't sign an NDA, you still cannot, because you're exposing personal details.
Right,
And there's-
Right.
Yeah.
But again,
I wouldn't use their names. I'm
Right.
worried about mine.
but again, the question, which is a fine question, can be, if not answered, at least addressed this way. Remember, a memoir has to have a theme.
Yes.
And one wants to see how you're coping with this. This is more important. Again, the truth, rather than
Facts.
the facts, and everybody, you know,
My
getting an
truth.
ID. Right, right. Peter Gethers, that name may be familiar to some of you, wrote a memoir early this year called My Mother's Kitchen, about his mother. His grandparents owned Ratner's Dairy Restaurant on the Lower East Side. And it's a fun memoir. You learn a good deal about the Lower East Side. Here we go, you know, wider culture, and how food was it, still of course is. But his mother was a typical, nice, middle-class Jewish lady who loved her family, who raised her children, and was very proud of her husband, who was a TV producer and director, and therefore they got to go to a lot of very famous restaurants in LA. And one day she's sitting there, and just out of the blue, according to her son, she says, "I want to be a chef." And she turned to the chef of this very well-known restaurant and said, "Can I work for you?" She was 53. And he said, "You work for me for 1 year as an intern, and you will be terrific." And she did, and she was, and she became buddies with Julia Child. My Mother's Kitchen, memoir. But it really isn't a memoir, although it's very revealing. It has a wonderful theme, because I don't learn anything about the author. I learn a good deal about his mother, which is wonderful, but it was more of a biography. So, but there he did hold back on a couple of names. So I recommend that just to see how someone else has done it. Sorry. Yes?
Further to that,
Yes.
I reread recently Running with Scissors.
Can everybody hear again?
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I reread it, and I also read that because he exposed the lie.
Matt, could you say what it's about?
Oh, it's a man who ends up living in his mother's psychiatrist's home. And apparently the psychiatrist is mad, the children are mad, everybody's mad, and he depicts it very well. But he had a legal problem with that where they sued him for being truthful. And he and his publisher finally added the line, "a memoir," to the title and got away from the legal liability.
That's a good point, or even a novelistic memoir. Or a memoir as a novel, or a novel as a memoir. There are different ways of handling that.
But that got away from, he was allowed to misrepresent everything, and it didn't matter what he said, because
Thank you.
there was an element
His
of
truth.
non-truth or whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
My family goes back to the 1600s in Sagaponic,
Oh,
and we were Rogers, Topping, Foster, Pearson. And so I have written a lot of short pieces about the 1950s growing up in Sagaponic, and the East Hampton Star has published almost everything I've sent into them. And it's a lot of fun, and I get to remember things, and it feels great. I just had one published called My Chickens, about bringing chickens from my aunt upstate down to Sagaponic and raising them and things like that. So
thank you for telling us about that.
they're really great over there, and they said they have a compilation of stories, and I have several from the past in there, like about my father, about experiences going to San Francisco so my ex-husband could get out of the Vietnam War, and all kinds of things. And they'll give you like a half a page there.
Yes, they will.
A lot of things to say.
Thank you for bringing that up for another reason, that it is publishing.
Yeah.
It is publishing as the memoir is short story, or is sketch, or character study, which is a fine other genre that I hadn't considered. I was thinking, however, maybe unfairly, of the memoir as a book. And I was thinking of what might attract a commercial publisher, or self-publishing that would gain some review or some traction. But thank you, that's very important.
It's a lot of fun. And
It is a lot of fun.
Buy 1,000 copies and give them to my relatives. And,
Well, that's what I suggested to my colleague who sent me the manuscript that I didn't think was more than a family album. But sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Because a lot of times someone defensively will say, listen, it is fun, which it is, and I'm just doing this because my kids should know, and I really love doing this, but secretly I really want to publish it and to have other people. What do you feel about that? Would you like to have a book out?
Yeah, maybe. I'm not sure. And I have so many more stories to tell that I have to just, and it has to be when it, like I'll say, oh, it's Christmas, let me write about it like, at Christmas. So I wrote about Lester Elliston, the beach mayor. I don't know if anybody here knows it, but down at Saguenay Beach, for many years, he has sort of taken it under his wings to make sure everybody's okay there. So they published that right, like in May, right before
The beach season, right.
Yeah.
I can see that you have kind of swung your sense of the memoir to biography, but that's okay.
Yeah.
That's fine. Other comments? I hope no one here is going to be intimidated from going back and writing. Again, I do think that the main point that you made is it's fun to write about your past.
Yeah.
But I do hope I have, yes, I'm sorry.
I was thinking.
Loud.
I was thinking.
Good.
while you were speaking.
This is
Yes,
good.
Yes, I kept my thinking cap on while you were speaking about something that I had written 20 years ago while I was on a sailboat. And when you're out in the water and the sky and nothing else, you have the opportunity to be involved with nature and yourself in no other way, because there's nothing else except for your safety and keeping things organized. That it interrupts your thoughts. And I came upon it just last week, cleaning out cupboards, and it's good. I mean, in the sense that it's readable, it's personal, and
I'm glad you said that, because I kind of want to put everything together in the sense that I do want to be encouraging. I would say, even though memoirs, if you go into a typical bookstore, can be found along with autobiographies and confessions and diaries and letters, they are really, when they're well done, I hope this has come across, pieces of creative writing. And I do sense that in the best of the memoirs, there has been dramatic license. But that's fine. Again, I fall back on Norman Mailer. I think the distinction between hewing to facts and subscribing to a larger thematic truth, which is usually psychological, which is usually an observation of the human condition. And when well done, as peculiar, meaning separate, as one's life is, has meaning for us all. Thank you
Joan,
so
I think
much.
there's one more
Oh, I'm so
question.
sorry.
Yes, Arlene had her hand raised.
What sort of holds me back from doing a memoir, which I thought of doing many times, I'm not sure of the facts, I'm not sure of the time, did this occur first, or in the middle, or later?
Well, here's a very interesting comment for those of you who didn't hear that Arlene was saying she's held back by not quite being certain that what she's remembering is the facts. I would say, quoting one of my main men, Wordsworth, feeling comes in aid of feeling. What you remember, what you want to remember, is the most important part. And again, I close on that note and invite you not to worry about, what the date is or what the detail is, but the larger emotion and the larger truth that you're recalling.
I think we'll, oh wait, maybe Martin has a comment.
You're inspired,
Yes.
and when you talk with me, question myself about things, or actually,
That'll be $100.
if you're on Medicare, still have
What's left, right?
No, I think it was a great presentation.
absolutely.
Joan, I would like to just, I think we're all so grateful to you for this fabulous talk. It was great.
Thank you. Joan, can I tell you I'm sitting here and I love to read and
I'm sure all of you love to read, so I just want to mention a few of my favorite memoirs. See,
With the caveat of don't trust the recommendations.
two. One is called A Mountain of Crumbs. It's a memoir about growing up in post-Soviet era Russia. It's a fabulous book, and we have it at the library. I had the author here. It's a great book. The Man in the White Sharkskin Suit. Someone probably have read that. Out of Africa, Andrei Asimov. One of my favorite, all-time favorite memoirs. Little Failure, you probably read that. Gary Stengard. One of the great, great memoirs, I think. And the other one is a Holocaust book, and I had the author here many years ago. He was a photographer for Look magazine, who died a number of years ago, whose mother died in the Holocaust, who promised his mother at some point he would write. And when he was in his 80s, he wrote a book that was vignettes of growing up in Poland during the war as a young child. It's called Anton the Dove Fancier and Other Tales of the Holocaust. It's one of my favorite all-time books. Anton the Dove Fancier. We have it
I
here.
reviewed it many years
Did you
ago.
review it?
Right, I think so.
I might have even sent you. I don't remember. He was a wonderful man. Anyway,
Right.
you've inspired me to read more. And
Well,
Joan,
thanks.
do you
just-
ever think about writing your own memoir, or you know?
I'll never remember the facts.
Thank you all for coming, and we're hoping for another visit from Joan before too long.